Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You're all very welcome to webinar number 25 in the Irish Bioenergy Association series webinars. My name is Sean Fine. I'm the CEO of the Irish Bioenergy Association. I welcome you all this morning. This is our first webinar after a break for the month of August for the summer. So we have a number of new participants and attendees this morning. So just a small bit of background information about the Irish Bioenergy Association. We were established in 1999. We are the representative body for the Irish bioenergy industry on the island of Ireland. And our sectors, we cover the sectors of biomass, biogas, biofuels, biochar, wood fuels, and energy crops. Our main work is around the area of policy lobbying and advocacy. We also are involved in transfer of knowledge to various stakeholders within the industry. We have a broad and diverse range of members, from farmers to foresters to technology providers, consultants, financial institutions, and anyone really with an interest in the bioenergy space. And we have a number of research and development projects, and full details are available on rbia.org. Our objective as an organisation is to work towards a sustainable energy future with bioenergy. This is just a reminder that this is number 25 in our webinar series. All our previous webinars are available to view on www.rbia.org. Our webinars generally take place fortnightly from 9:30 to 10:30 on Wednesday. And if any member or any attendee this morning would like to discuss about presenting at a future webinar, feel free to get in touch with myself or my colleague, Teresa O'Brien. And I'd like to acknowledge the work of Teresa in getting all of this set up behind the scenes to make sure it all runs smoothly. So thank you, Teresa, for your ongoing assistance to make sure this webinar series rolls out successfully. This morning, we will hear a presentation from my colleague, Noel Gavigan, who is our Technical Executive in the Irish Bioenergy Association. We will have a discussion after, and we will include answers to your questions, and you can post your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we will endeavour to answer many of your questions as possible. I'd like you to note the dates of our next series of webinars. So we will be dedicating the month of October to the RBA National Bioenergy Conference 2021 by rolling out a series of webinars each Wednesday in October from 9:30 a.m. to 11 a.m. The theme of our conference this year is COP26, the critical role of bioenergy, and we will focus over the 4 weeks on the 4 COP goals. Full details will be published through our social media channels and communication channels in the coming days. So just to let you know what the 4 COP goals are and the topics which we will be covering over the 4 weeks. So the first one is about securing global net zero by mid-century and keeping 1.5 degree within reach. We will discuss that particular topic on Wednesday, the 6th of October, with obviously a focus on how bioenergy can contribute to that. COP Goal 2 is adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. And our second webinar as part of our conference series will take place on Wednesday, the 13th of October, where we have a lineup of interesting speakers and panelists to discuss that particular topic. Webinar 3 falls in conjunction with Bioeconomy Ireland Week, and we will discuss the topic of mobilising finance on Wednesday, the 20th of October. And then we will conclude our series of conference special webinars with Goal 4 discussion on working together to deliver will be the topic and the theme, and that will be on the 27th of October, again from 9:30 to 11. So please follow our social media channels, and you will receive full details of our speaker lineup and registration details over the coming weeks. And we do hope that you can join us for our series of webinars. So webinar on Goal 1 will be our next webinar. So on the 6th of October, that will be our next webinar. So just briefly introducing this morning's topic, we're going to discuss this morning the Renewable Heat Obligation for Ireland. This is part of a public consultation which has been launched by DECC in recent weeks. There is significant potential to develop the renewable heat sector in Ireland. Noel has charts to show where we stand from a renewable heat perspective across Europe at the bottom of the table. This Renewable Heat Obligation Scheme would be a market-driven support. and Noel will go into the details of what's being proposed as part of the consultation. I'd just like to remind you about the recently launched Renewable Energy Ireland 40 by 30 Renewable Heat Plan. For anyone that hasn't read it, we would encourage you to read the 40 by 30 report and to provide any assistance you can to ourselves and the other renewable energy associations in our lobbying efforts to secure a 40% renewable heat target by 2030, and for that to be included in the upcoming revision of the Climate Action Plan. REI brings together renewable heat, so all the renewable energy associations, and we work together to develop this plan, and we're collectively advocating for its implementation. As I said, the purpose of this morning's webinar is to outline the RHO consultation and ensure we would encourage you all to make a submission to the consultation by the deadline of the 1st of October. So our speaker this morning is Noel Gavigan. Noel is the Technical Executive of the Irish Bioenergy Association. Noel's main role is in policy delivery and technical backup for members, and working with us in terms of the technical detail around various consultations and technical aspects associated with bioenergy. Noel also manages the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Programme for RBA and has worked on many projects down through the years, including the Biomass Trade Centre project, the Biogas 3 project, and is currently actively involved in the EIP Small Biogas Demonstration project and also the Wood Fuel Quality Assurance Certification Scheme. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Noel to share his screen and to begin his presentation. So over to you, Noel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Sean, for the introduction there. Yeah, just I suppose really where we decided on going with this is the consultation is quite a game changer.
Just go to presentation mode. No, sorry to interrupt you.
It's quite a game changer in terms of how we will look at supporting renewable heat in Ireland, and it's probably well overdue that we look at a support scheme that's going to bring on much more changes into how we are optimizing our heat. The scheme itself, sorry, that's clicking on a bit too fast. Moment. Now, so the scheme itself, there's a lot of policy background to this. Principally, we had our 2020 target of 16% renewable electricity, which we failed to meet. Within that target, we had a 12% renewable heat target. We only got to barely over half of that at 6.3%. So we were far behind on our target in terms of meeting renewable heat. And it's important to note that the target set for 2030 starts at 12% and moves forward from there. The programme for government commits us to a 51% reduction of greenhouse gases by 2030, which is further enforced then by this year the announcement of the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, which sets a statutory requirement of that 51% target, which is in the programme for government. So that's quite significant to have in place, and it will hold ministers accountable for meeting that target. The European Commission Fit for 55 again is setting a 55% cut in greenhouse gases by 2030. So all those policy measures are pointing in the direction of us needing to adapt dramatically. And we all know where the discussion is going around climate change and the need for reduction in carbon emissions. So it all fits in that this is a policy like this is brought on board. Another principal act is the Renewable Energy Directive, and in that within Article 23 sets a very clear requirement of an increase of 1.3% per year. Now, where that's significant is it's measured in two periods, from 2021 to 2025 and 26 then to 2030. Where that's significant is that our base on that is the 12% target we had for 2020, which we did not meet. We were approximately 6% shy of that. On that, we're adding 1.3%. We've got to, by 2025, have caught up on that target. And then by 2030, we're going to have to meet the target as it moves forward to 25% in total by 2030. So it does set a very clear requirement for the use of a lot of renewable heat sources over the next decade. And it sets out the agenda for us to follow. And it's all of these different legislative pieces all tie into the one goal. Some will change, will differ in the numbers and in the targets, but in general, it's all going that strong direction. As it stands, we talked about that 6.3% on a European context. We are right down at the very bottom of the EU states. So we have abysmally failed to meet the target that was set. And we have a lot of catching up to do, because it's not a simple thing that 6.3 is our starting point. The 12% target we had for 2020 is our target, and we need to catch up on that before we meet the other targets that are set out for us. The consultation process itself, it's obviously Irish-based. It's set by the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. It's a 25-question consultation which sets out the different frameworks in it. The document itself is available on their website, and it's quite comprehensive. Certain areas we could do some more details in, and we'll go through some of that during the course of this discussion. But in general, the responses will be centered around those 25 questions. Within our own membership, we will be circulating some of our thoughts on that over the coming weeks, but this is a start on it. The responses are due by Friday of the 1st of October, and you can see there the email address that goes into renewableheat@decc.gov.ie. Again, we would encourage people to read the document, understand what's involved, and to submit a response based on what they see on it. So first and foremost, what is an obligation system and how does it work? We haven't had one of these in the heat sector before, but we have the Biofuel Obligation Scheme operating in the transport sector for the last 10 years. Road fuels, currently the level is approximately 7%. It's rising steadily. I think it started off around 2%, 2.5%, but it was an area that Erbia was very strongly involved in. Both before the Biofuel Obligation Scheme came out. It was a previous MOT scheme from 2005 to 2010. And it has set the agenda for how we decarbonise transport over that decade. And we have got to a 7% level. Now, it includes double counting, and there's questions over that. And it's something that is needed, and we do support having for certain levels of biofuels. What that does and how an obligation system works is it puts the onus on the importer of the fuel, or in this context, the importer of the fuel, which, there's a small number of oil companies that are the importers. They are obliged to make sure that level of substitution is met. So the onus is on them. By the time it gets to your local distributor, or to you, obviously, as the consumer, that obligation is already met. So it puts the onus right back on the importer. Obviously, the cost is going to be passed on to the consumer itself, so it does socialise the cost. It does put it to that level, and it means that the government is not having to pay it. So the substitution basically is biodiesel is used to blended with diesel, ethanol is blended with petrol at various rates. We've seen it interesting over the past decade where biodiesel used to be more available and was a cheaper fuel, so you would see a lot of biodiesel used. Whereas now ethanol is the cheaper fuel. So you see what actually happens is you see certs being traded from petrol to diesel because it's an overall obligation. It's not an obligation on each particular fuel. It's actually not an obligation on each particular supplier. In terms of they can trade certificates on it. Now, any renewable fuel used in a vehicle can generate those certificates. So once there's biodiesel, ethanol, biomethane going into a vehicle, it is eligible to earn certificates. Now, which I haven't listed here, NORA, which is the National Oil Reserves Agency, they administer the scheme. I think there's a consultant in doing that work for them, or a consultant company doing it for them, but they're the body that is responsible for it. So the certificates, once you put essentially a litre of fuel, or the equivalent of a litre of fuel on the market, put it into a vehicle, you generate a virtual cert for that, and that cert can then be used by an importer of fuel to offset the fossil fuel that they're bringing in. And again, going back to the point that the government does not have to provide any financial support for a scheme like this, and this is why they like obligation schemes. It is the market itself. You're basically stating to the market, you must meet this target, and do whatever the costs are involved, you need to absorb the costs. So it puts the onus really on the marketplace to meet the obligation. Now, there's the Biofuel Obligation Scheme. There's a lot of lessons in that we can learn from, and it's something that Erbia was very, very involved in, especially in the early years, because we had a lot of members involved in supplying biofuels, whether it was pure plant oils for diesel engines, biodiesel, which I was involved in the project myself, or ethanol. So it was quite a busy area for us as an organisation. What happened in that it's worth noting, because obviously there's a small number of importers of fuel, and for them to blend in the levels that they wanted, they actually discovered that it was far easier to buy in pre-blended fuel from, be it Milford Haven or be it from Rotterdam, as they were buying in their diesel. they basically contacted their supplier. We want 3,000 tons of DERV next week, and can you make sure that there's 2%, 3%, whatever, 7% biodiesel included in that? So they could meet their obligation very easily without having to go blending on the port in Dublin or other ports around the country in their facilities. They could actually meet it just with through the trade. So what happened there was, if you were a supplier here in Ireland of biofuel, it was actually very hard to access that market. You couldn't go to roll up to a facility in a port, and we talked to them, and they were, in fairness, very amicably looking at how we could work this. But it turned out unworkable because they were dealing with shipments of 3,000 tons. They were not able to cater with truckloads of biofuels coming into a port facility, and they would need blend facilities and whatever else to have in place. So ultimately what happened was the indigenous suppliers we had of biofuels here all overnight basically stopped trading. We were left with one, which still operates, and where they were protected in the market was the fact that they were building on a port, and so they could trade internationally. But for any indigenous producer, it effectively closed the businesses essentially overnight. So so all of our obligation was met by imported materials, or even if it was Irish material, it was generally sent abroad to be blended and brought back again. So it did really show, it was a stark lesson for us as an organisation in how an obligation scheme can fail for the indigenous market, but it can meet the target that the government has set. So it's just worth noting that. Just a point there as well, I noticed if you've any, I see one question coming in. If you do have questions on any of this, just put it into the Q&A and we'll pick them up in a few minutes' time. So the main aspects of the proposed Renewable Heat Obligation Scheme is, again, to socialise the cost of the transition. So the onus is going to be put on the marketplace to meet these obligation levels. Those that are obliged are the fuels are the LPG, fossil gas, oil, coal, peat will all raise an obligation. Electricity going into heat is not, because they consider that electricity is being decarbonised by a different route, and that's fine. So that's any electrical heating or heat pumps are not going to be subject to this. The suppliers, the onus falls back on the supplier to include a percentage, as we discussed earlier. But what is interesting on this is they have set a limit that the supplier must be providing at least 400 gigawatt hours to be obliged. So if you were under that level, if you happen to be importing fuel or putting fossil fuel on the market and you're below that level, there is no obligation on you. Now, that's quite a high level. The 400 gigawatt hours I've just translated there, it's equivalent to about 33,000 homes. So a good sized town in Ireland, you could supply all of that without having to meet the obligation. Now, there is a danger in that we would see, and we'll be putting it in our consultation response, that there is a potential you could set up, gas companies in individual towns. The potential to do that is set up Tullamore Gas or Trim Gas that would supply gas to that town, would not have to meet the obligation, and would therefore be able to provide lower cost fuel to the consumer. So there's a danger in that, and that's something that we're concerned about, and we think the mechanism by where you put that barrier, that once you cross over, whether it's the border or whatever else, that the obligation should be for all fuels at point of entry. So that's one thing we're going to consult on. The obligation itself starts in 2023. There's flexibility for the first 2 years to allow people, if you meet your targets over the period 2023, I think 24, 25, over in mass, then that's okay. If you don't hit them in 2023, you won't be fined in the first year, because you'll be allowed to balance it over the next couple of years. That's to allow the market catch up. That's understandable. The obligation will start at a 0.5% level. And I've some figures on that later on to exactly what that translates to, and that will increase up to the year 2030. The increase rate, the discussion, the low, medium and high, 3%, 5% or 10% is discussed in the document. Again, I'm going to give you some information on what sort of levels that translates to. And obviously, as I said earlier, the obligations can be traded between one person and another. So if the obligation this year is 3%, and I'm a fuel supplier and I've only put in 1%, and another company has put in 5%, I can buy that excess 2% off them, assuming that the quantities are the same. So you can actually trade that, and it becomes a commodity that you can trade around. Now, again, that didn't necessarily work on the Biofuel Obligation Scheme because of the marketplace. It was easier for them to buy the obligation, the blended fuels, and for them to access a market and trade with a number of different suppliers to buy those certs wasn't necessarily something that they were willing to do or could do. So it's something that one thing we will look for is the marketplace on certs is much more open. The obligations, again, obviously enough, there's a lot of requirements around what is considered a renewable fuel. So again, that's all set out in the RED directive. So that's in terms of sustainability, carbon reductions. It's an extensive document, the RED 2 directive, and it sets out the full requirements in that. So if you're putting in a biofuel, a biomass fuel or whatever else, or biomethane, it needs to meet certain criteria, which is obviously enough, something we all like to see. In terms of the overall demand, this is just a picture of what the marketplace is like in Ireland and what we're looking at. 2019, we had total demand in Ireland of heating fuels of 55 terawatt hours. Predominantly, as you can see, oil and gas were the two big players there, a little over 40% each, 6% renewables, and then coal and peat making up most of the remainder. The 0.5% obligation, just to give people an idea of what we're talking about here, so that would be the equivalent of 11 million litres of oil, plus 10 million cubic meters of gas, plus 2,000 tons of, a little over 2,000 tons of coal being replaced, and a little over 2,000 tons of peat. So that just gives you an idea of what levels of fuel are required. And again, that comes in at about a quarter of a terawatt hour. The 3% obligation for 2030, which is the lower in the tier of low, medium and high targets, comes in total at about 1.6 terawatt hours. Now, I'll discuss that 1.6 later on. It's worth noting that 1.6 because it fits in with something else that has happened. Then 10% level, which is the higher level, you're looking at 5.5 terawatt hours, and you can see roughly what level of fuel you're looking at replacing by that time. So 10% is obviously an ambitious target, but when you consider that our overall target of 25% by 2030, I think 10%, or we would be proposing that 10% should absolutely be the target that is set for 2030. In terms of what we have in Ireland to meet that requirement, you know, if we want to meet that 5.5 terawatt hours, I'm going to refer you back to our own and the Renewable Energy Ireland 40 by 30 report, which actually sets out a detailed study in terms of what resources are available to us that are renewable. And within that, we looked at indigenous forestry, we looked at tallow, residual MSW, we looked at biogas, surplus heat for district heating, electrification of heat. We've actually have enough resources here in Ireland to meet 66 terawatt hours. So when you consider that the entire market for heat in Ireland is only 55 terawatt hours, we actually have sufficient resources to meet all of our heating requirements with renewable heat. So the 10% target is actually, when you look at that, is quite conservative. And if we want to look at what ambition we can have for 2030, we can actually do an awful lot of work towards decarbonising the entire heat sector, possibly. And as we say, 40% by 2030, that's where the 40 by 30 comes from, is a realistic target in terms of rolling out infrastructure. And it's something that we think should be considered strongly. So after that, I'll just go into some of the individual fuels. So biomethane, obviously biomethane can be used for direct substitution into the gas grid through injection. You could also use biomethane for off-site applications. The consultation document sets a lot of the pricing based on biomethane price, where the quote 8 to 12 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, the biogas industry, which is ourselves, we have spent a lot of time consulting with our own members over the last number of years, looking at what pricing would be required to stimulate investment. And we would be needing, especially for crop-based digesters, in excess of 13 cents. So that's worth noting in terms of, unless you get a figure that's high enough, that 13 cent level plus, you're actually not going to stimulate any investment in biogas facilities here in the country. So we have to be very careful about ensuring that is considered. The consultation statement that biomethane is the cheapest fuel, we wouldn't consider that as borne out by the marketplace. We know that biomass is cheaper. We know that using heat pumps is cheaper. We know district heating is cheaper. So we think that biomethane, it's definitely a very worthwhile fuel to consider. It is very versatile, but there are other fuels out there that also need to be considered. But again, going back to that graph where I'm showing you all the different fuels that can be used, there is a need for all of those. There's no silver bullet in terms of meeting the challenges that we have to face. So there is a need for all technologies, but just in terms of the pricing, we need to have a look at that. There is a danger, and then going back to the Biofuel Obligation Scheme, there is some danger that the Renewable Heat Obligation could be largely met by imported biomethane, especially on the gas grid side of it. So we have to be very careful on that. There's a lot of excess plant across Europe. Exactly how much excess we haven't determined as yet, but because they have existing plants, they have an advantage. We do not have a large number of biogas plants. We have a very small number of biogas plants here. We have one injecting onto the grid, the second under construction. So we do have some capacity, but we don't have the capacity that's in Europe. And because we can look at internationally trading through our pipelines, there is a danger that the indigenous industry is not supported through this. Then again, the last thing then is to mention is that 1.6 terawatt hours. You might recall where I mentioned the, let's go back to the previous, sorry, a moment. This 1.6 terawatt hours for the 3% minimum obligation, which you're talking about for 2030, that 1.6 can be met by biomethane itself with quite a modest investment. I think we're talking about something like 28 biomethane plants, and that's through the Urbia Cray proposal, which we put together along with industry. We took a lot of time spent with people who've developed biogas plants, looking at the costs, looking at what was capable of being put in place. So that's looking at 1.6. Another figure which we're likely to see coming out shortly is the SEI were eagerly awaiting their own heat report, and we know through that we've seen some information which shows that the land area would suggest what we could easily have available is maybe 7.5 terawatt hours. So there's figures floating around in that. Biomass as a material to contribute into the renewable heat obligation. The consultation doesn't mention a lot. It's a little bit vague about how it's handled, but it does appear to confirm that it will generate obligation certs. It will generate the certs. But there is one question over the measurement we would have in terms of, it says at the customer point of sale. So does that mean if you're commercial and industrial, it's easy to measure that. But what happens when you're looking at domestic supply? We have quite a lot of domestic users of wood pellet and firewood, which actually adds up to quite a bit. And how is that going to be brought into this marketplace? I would assume we're not going to be looking at that to measure sales at retail outlets. So is there another mechanism we could use there to amalgamate those quantities? But that does mean that biomass fuel suppliers will be in a position to provide some certification back to the fossil fuel industry, and it will help to underpin the market as long as the mechanisms that are put in place are able to support indigenous fuels, and you don't have a case of where it's all imported like happened with the Biofuel Obligation Scheme. So we need to be very careful of how that is managed. Hydrogen is a big word coming up in this consultation. It's obviously something a lot of people are talking about, and in particular in this, they're talking about green hydrogen, which we think is the only form that should be used. Now, green hydrogen, whether it's coming from biomass or whether it's coming from renewable electricity. Now, there is quite a bit of capacity to use green hydrogen, but we have to be very, very careful in how that's determined. What is green hydrogen? We have to be very clear on the grid rules to ensure that the hierarchy of renewable electricity usage is properly put together. If we don't, there is a real danger that CO2 emissions will actually increase rather than decrease. And that is because we have to look at how is when you've renewable electricity on the grid, we also have fossil. We've seen in the last week where there's been 3 shocks, another shock yesterday evening in terms of our supply, where we're in danger of where that supply is coming from. If we're using a lot of fossil on the grid, we have to ensure that you can only produce green hydrogen when renewable is actively being curtailed, and it can't be double subsidized. Obviously, you can't generate a refit or a RHES support for your green electricity and produce green hydrogen from it, because it's going to be supported through the RHO. So you obviously have to avoid the double subsidy. So we just need to be very clear about how hydrogen is going to be used, and in terms of the cost, obviously as well, cost of electricity comes in there as a major factor. GNI have indicated that a gas grid can take up to 20% hydrogen. So I suppose one question on that, is there any modification required to the grid equipment, to the infrastructure, to industrial equipment, or to indeed household appliances for them to be able to take 20% hydrogen? So there is some clarification needed on that to see what level of hydrogen is safe on the grid. Obviously, it's a different type of gas than methane, and we need to ensure that it's not going to cause any difficulty. The proposal to allow double counting is within this RHO consultation. It's something that we're still trying to figure out in terms of, we do know that RED 3 or RED 2 has been looked at new proposals, and that they are looking at scrapping double counting use for biofuels. There's a question, especially with green hydrogen going into the heat market, is it going to cause a lot of market distortion? So we need to be very careful about how that's managed. And again, going back to the fact that if you put it in the wrong way, you'll actually increase CO2 emissions dramatically rather than reduce. So we need to be very careful in terms of how green hydrogen is incorporated into this, and more detail is required in how that's going to operate. And again, hydrogen from other sources, we are assumed, but it's not said there, that hydrogen from other sources will be can be used. Now, hydrogen as itself, there is, as we all know, it's something that's in development. There is not a lot of hydrogen being used around the world coming from renewable sources. So, and costs on that are quite high. So we have to look in terms of, is it ready for the marketplace as well? District heating. So again, within the obligation, they're saying that waste heat or renewable heat will not be subject to the obligation, which is obviously welcome and expected. But it's not clear whether using that waste heat or renewable heat can offset the obligation. You would assume it will, but it would be good for them to clarify that, because when they say it's not subject to the obligation, if you were dealing with the Biofuel Obligation Scheme and something is not subject to it, you might be in danger of it not actually being part of it at all. We already see that your electrification of heat is not going to be part of this at all. It's been dealt with through the greening up of the grid itself. So we have to be very clear on that. What are they saying here? Are they saying that district heating is going to be able to generate obligation certificates, or is it not? Definitely we would think it should be able to, because it is a clear, district heating is an excellent way of encouraging the use of renewable electricity, of recycling waste heat as well, and putting that into the marketplace. So it is a central core of how we're going to meet the targets going forward. So, you know, we would see that as a clear benefit. So there is some clarification needed in that. We will, in our own response, seek those clarifications. But it would be very encouraging for district heating to be able to generate the levels of the certificates. It would help to underpin the costs of setting up a lot of district heating as well. The main points for us as an organisation, as we look through it, to see what, and again, go back, so I would have mentioned most of these already, but these are the main points we will be considering in our own consultation response. And that is this 400 gigawatt hours, that if you're a supplier supplying less than 33,000 houses, you won't be obliged to meet this obligation. The obligation will not be on you. So we would have a real question over that. That is something we would like to see not being the case. And we would like to see that some mechanism is put in that all fossil fuels on the market are subject to this, because otherwise you could have small suppliers bringing in relatively large quantities of heating oil into the country without being subject to it. So we need, or even gas through the gas grid. So we have to be very, very careful about how that's managed, and we need to shore that up before it becomes a loophole within this scheme. Again, hydrogen, we will responding on the double counting to get clarification of that. We're not exactly a fan of that in terms of hydrogen being used for heating, again, because of our questions over the carbon emissions. Is there going to be pushback on carbon emissions that if you're putting in hydrogen onto the grid because you're using electricity, rather than curtailing fossil, which you should be doing, are you going to increase the emissions overall rather than decrease? Technology readiness is another question. The other side here, the 3% target, we do think represents very low ambition. Our overall target is 25% by 2030. So we think that 10% as a minimum should be considered as the target for the obligation scheme by 2030. And there is, as you can see, the resources that we have available in Ireland are far more than adequate to meet that 10%. You know, there's a clear case for 10% being the low ambition target rather than the high ambition target. And we would like to see more ambition in it. Concerned that the obligation, as I said earlier, will not support indigenous renewable fuels. So we are in the European market. Fuels are traded internationally across Europe, but we just need to make sure that the mechanisms do help to support our own indigenous supply. The penalty levels that are in it are at 160 to 240 euros per megawatt hour. We would look at the higher level on that. Again, going back to the Biofuel Obligation Scheme, the penalty level on that is very high at I think it's 49 cents a litre if you don't meet the target. So what has actually happened is, and I spoke with the former CEO of Nora last year while he was still in office, and over the 10 years, nobody has ever had to pay that 49 cents. It was prohibitive. They all made sure they met the target, and it has been a mark of success for the Biofuel Obligation Scheme that the prohibitive, the penalty for not meeting the target is high enough. And it just shows that the target can be met. So there is no excuse for somebody not meeting the target when we've got 66 terawatt hours available to them. So we think that the prohibition on this should be a lot higher than 240 per megawatt hour. There's a question there in terms of biomethane and green hydrogen. Are they better used in transport? And this is an overall question we need to look at in our renewables policies. Is it best used in heat? Are we better off using biomethane in heavy goods vehicles, which are quite difficult to decarbonize, very difficult to decarbonize the heavy goods vehicle fleet, bus fleet, all large vehicles like that. So are we better off using chemical fuels, so your high density biomethane or green hydrogen in transport rather than in heat? So it's something that's a question we need to consider. And then lastly, that we've looked at off-gas grid use is also counted. So just some clarification on that if somebody's producing biogas on a small facility and using it for their own heat needs, can that generate certificates and so that it is counted and it can go towards meeting the costs of operating and building that plant. So that's basically what we've seen going through this document. We've a list of the questions there that are engaged as well, but I don't think we may not need to go through those. We have a number of questions coming in there, so we might start going through those. So as you can see, though, there's quite a bit in the consultation itself. It does bring up a number of good questions. Overall, we would welcome it, and I think it's important to point out that it is welcomed. That it as a mechanism to support the transition can be very successful. But again, the Biofuel Obligation Scheme being the example, it needs to be managed in the correct way so that we ensure that it is, we would like to see it obviously favouring indigenous fuels or to making sure that it can support indigenous fuels, but that it can meet the obligations and it can be used to increase the renewable sector here considerably in Ireland. And we think that it can only do good in that sense, as long as it's designed correctly. Thank you, Sean.
Thanks very much, Noel, for your presentation. And I suppose just to note that Noel's slides are obviously our interpretation of the document as we read it, and there's quite a few questions coming in. So I suppose if we move now, Noel, to some of the questions to see can we address them. And if you have any further questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is from Garrett there, Noel. By having an obligation on fuel, does this put the cost of fuel up? And also, is this in addition to carbon tax on fossil fuel for vehicles? So
now, first of all, you can expect it is going to put the cost up. They have in the consultation document some figures on what they expect it to be, and they base that based on the average house using, I think, is it 11 megawatt hours per year for heat. So they have some indications in there. We're talking, I think, I don't recall the numbers exactly, but I think upwards to maybe 100 euros per household, but down as low as I think 20, 30. But I'm not familiar with that figure, so I'd have to go back and have a look at that. You can expect, look, the cost of decarbonisation, it does come. So you can expect it is going to cost the user a certain amount.
Yep. Sorry, no, page 17 of the document has a chart of the estimated cost per household, and it shows an upward trajectory as the obligation scheme would increase as time proceeds. So just to point, I suppose the second part of that question, Noel, obviously this is about vehicles and carbon tax on fossil fuels. So this obligation isn't about vehicles and transport, is about heat. So, but I think carbon tax will still apply. Is that correct?
Yes, carbon tax will still apply to all fossil fuels. Okay.
The next question is from Stevie, and his question is, how will coal meet the obligation? So can you just explain maybe
Well, ultimately, coal, obviously, the coal industry will need to meet the obligation rather than coal. Coal obviously can't because it's a high carbon fuel, but the coal industry is going to have
unless
to
it's
look
a biomass based
yes,
coal product.
Yeah, they will have to look at replacing. I think the level I have there is about 2,000 tons to meet the initial figure. So that's sort of level they will need to be putting in.
Okay, that answers that one. Just a clarification here, Noel, from Tony. And I'm not sure what figure Tony is talking about, but at the start you discussed the obligation would begin at 12%, increasing to 25% by 2030. And then later you discussed the obligation starting at 0.5, increasing to 3 or 10. Can you outline the difference between these two?
So the obligation on the state is to go from, our target for 2020 was 12%. That needs to rise to 25, or will rise to 25 by 2030. So we have to be 25% renewable heat by 2030. I'm sorry. But the obligation is only on, it's an obligation that's been put on the fossil fuel industry that are importing or are putting fossil fuels on the marketplace. So for example, what's not included in this at all is heat pumps, because heat pumps are, that's a separate technology altogether, and that they will contribute quite a lot in meeting the 25% target, separate. So that 3% to 10% is only part of how we're going to meet that 25% target by 2030.
And the obligation scheme, I think the answer to this is the obligation scheme is completely separate to the actual renewable heat targets which exist in terms of other pieces of legislation coming from Europe or other sources. Okay.
Now, the obligation scheme could be put up as high as 25% easily enough, and we think there's ample material to meet that. It's just we need.
Well, they're two distinct, different
two separate targets.
One is an obligation, another is an actual reduction.
The 25% target is a target on the state. The 10%, if we say we're going with that, is the target that the state is now putting on the marketplace.
Okay, Thomas, a question for Thomas: will electrification of heat qualify for blending of fossil fuels?
No, they're quite clear on that, in the fact that electrification is being decarbonised by other methods, by bringing a lot more renewables on the grid. So they're quite clear that it's not going to be linked in with this.
So there are other like RESS and other support schemes. So double counting support isn't allowed.
Exactly. It's more the double counting there. The double subsidy. You can't double subsidize something. So that's why they could not allow electrification be covered by this as well.
Okay, just an anonymous attendee here just put in, it's probably more of a note. I'll just read it out. Will the heat, or maybe a query too, will the heat obligation be additional to the Energy Efficiency Obligation Scheme, which was implemented under Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive? This supposes a legal obligation of member states to achieve a new saving from energy efficiency for each year from 1st of January 2014 to 31st of December 2020. Under the implementation, energy suppliers who sold more than 600 gigawatts of energy per year were and still are obligated to deliver the required savings. This includes all of the big well-known gas, electricity and oil companies, and contacts for all the obligated parties are listed on the SEI website. Have you any comment, Noel, on that?
No, I can't answer it straight. I know there's a mention of it, but I'm not sure if it's going to link in or not. I think they're two separate obligations. So I do think that
if anonymous attendee wants to post their email address in the chat to us,
we can come
back to them and discuss this further offline and get further information. Derek has a query here. In order to protect against the potential impact of imported biomethane, is there perhaps a possibility to award a higher value to certificates for indigenous biogas versus imported biogas or other similar incentives? So I think it's a very good point, and maybe something we should consider as part of our submission. But Noel, what would your comment be on that from Derek?
It's we would like to have some mechanism like that. The only question is that going to be allowed under EU rules? Because we are operating in the European market, so the mechanisms that are there, unfortunately, are quite exposed by that because of that. It can be difficult to consider. There's competition rules and everything. We need to clarify how this would impact on it, putting in a different level of reward for indigenous as opposed to imported.
Just Noel, if you could stop sharing your slide and just broaden up the screen for the. Okay, this next question it's will waste materials such as biological refuse waste be eligible to generate certificates? And would there be a favour waste being supported under an obligation scheme? So I suppose just on that point, I suppose that waste could potentially be used to generate biomethane, which would be part of the scheme. But what's your comment, Noel, on that in terms of?
Yeah, it will be absolutely waste material. So whether it's going to a biogas plant, whether it's recycled timber, it will be eligible to. It's considered a renewable source, or if it's waste heat itself coming off an industrial process.
But not waste that hasn't been processed from the point of view of, it says biological refuse waste. So it would have to be processed to be turned into a fuel. Is that your understanding? And then that fuel will generate the certs.
It will go back to, if you can clarify it as renewable under the Renewable Energy Directive, that is going to that sets out the guidelines. So, for example, you could have, this refuse-derived fuel of different types. Is it purely biological? Is it organic fines, which is a mixed material? So, but it sets out criteria within the RED directive as to what's considered renewable. And again, one piece of legislation is standing on another in the fact that it's using the RED directive and the rules and requirements around that in terms of what's considered.
So if anonymous attendee again wants to post their email address in the chat, we can maybe look into this further and have a discussion offline on this particular aspect.
Well, it would depend on the material itself, but if it's classified as renewable under the RED directive, then it should be able to generate certs.
Okay. Another question here, Noel, is there a risk of some heat feedstocks or technology being over-rewarded in a heat obligation policy? Is there an argument for adjusting the number of certificates that are awarded to the finished fuel? So what's your comment on that?
Well, the ultimate idea of having an obligation scheme like this is that you have a marketplace that ultimately the cheaper fuels and will be the ones that will actually provide most of will be the first that are used. So to some extent, there may be some over rewarding of some fuels that are quite cheap if the marketplace means that, if there's not enough of it and you end up then having to use some higher cost fuels. So they haven't put in place a mechanism by which you would have a different level of rate for each of the fuels apart from the double certing of the hydrogen. But in truth, what's going to happen is those that are obligated to have those certs, the importers or the people that put fuel in the marketplace, they are going to be looking for those certs wherever they are available from, if they're not actually supplying renewable fuel themselves. So ultimately, that price, each cert is going to have the same value regardless of how it is generated. So if you've got a technology that's very low cost and it's able to generate a cert, that's your luck. Whereas if you have a technology that it can produce a cert but it's very high cost, and it's not worth it's higher than the cost of you're going to get for the cert itself, well then unfortunately that's it's not a workable solution.
Okay, no, next one from Thomas. Should EU ETS facilities be excluded from the RHO, and will industry leave Ireland, resulting in global emission increases? And maybe there's some of these questions that we might need to get clarification on and return to the particular.
Don't go into mentioning the EU ETS in this. Generally, it's considered, when you look at a mechanism like this, it's separated from it. So it's something that there isn't much. We tend to see the ETS has always been a separate mechanism.
Okay, so maybe we need to look
into
that in further detail.
There is no mention of the ETS in it itself. So we were taking it from that it's not, they work through a different mechanism altogether. And there's more on the carbon side of it, but usually the ETS are responsible for meeting their own targets, their own targets set, not necessarily by the member states.
Okay, a question or comment here from Jury. I haven't heard the call from the bioenergy industry to keep the fossil fuels in the ground. Why is this logical demand not made?
It's a good point. Look, I suppose when we look at the overall, you might have heard me earlier on saying that we have 66 terawatt hours of renewable sources of heat available. We have an ambition of, we said, a realistic ambition of going to 40% by 2030. But in truth, if we really wanted it, we could do an awful lot more. Ultimately, yes, we by 2050 we do want to reach net zero, but when you consider the level of resources that are available to us, look, a bit of higher ambition absolutely wouldn't go astray here. And it really depends on what the marketplace, or whether politically we'll have the will to do so.
And as much fossil, we fully support the concept of as much as fossil being left in the ground. I suppose our objective as an organisation is to displace that fossil with biological, with bioenergy and other renewable sources. So
and look, going back to both the Biofuel Obligation Scheme, which is at a 7%, I think it's 11 by volume there at this stage, but it's you've got that level. When you consider that was started off 10 years ago, could we not have had more ambition? Could we have got to 20 or 25% by now? And similar to this, we're looking at now a decade of a heat obligation. 10%, to be honest with you, is quite low as a target, and we should be looking at a lot higher than that. We have the materials, we have the heat available for a much higher target. So definitely it should be strongly considered.
I think just a follow-on point, and might be, look at this more of a comment maybe than a question, with zero fossil fuels from the same, from Jury as well, with zero fossil fuels on sale, any mix of hydrogen, methane or fluids makes no sense. So Thomas has a question here. Would a GHG reduction option similar to RHOS, which is the Renewable Electricity Support Scheme, be better to drive decarbonisation of heat? The levy to fund it could be collected by suppliers. So I suppose, Noel, what's your comment in terms of the difference between an obligation scheme and an auction system? And
yeah, to a certain extent, it's, again, both of them are free market mechanisms. I think the term is cap and trade in some jurisdictions, but you are expecting, you're putting an onus on the market to meet a level of reduction, and it's open to them to how they're going to meet that reduction. So in this case, if they do a 10% reduction, there's a huge amount of renewable technologies available to get those certs from. But it is an open question as to the cost of those. It is an open market in terms of an auction. The trading, I suppose, we would like to see a platform that's a bit more open than the Biofuel Obligation Scheme, because essentially that has not been open to the wider industry, and that has caused, you know, we've no indigenous supply here in Ireland. So I think one of the things we have to ensure is that an auction system, a trading, a marketplace platform is in place for those certificates.
Okay, just a couple of points of information from Shane on the Biofuel Obligation Scheme. He says that the obligation is placed on the company that pays the NORA levy. This may or may not be the importer, so that's just a clarification.
Yeah,
and two, the obligation in 2020 was 11% by volume, inclusive of double counting, and gave rise to an approximate blend rate of approximately 6% by volume. So that's just 2 points of information. Thanks, Shane, for providing that feedback. Okay, moving on. Where does it mention that Ireland's target for 2030 will start at 12 and not at the 6.3% we ended on?
Article 23 of the Red Directive is that. So basically, I was going through it again this morning, but it sets out that the share of renewable energy, the target that was set in 2020, is our starting point.
So that means that we have an even bigger challenge than a lot of other states who are significantly ahead of us in terms of percentage of renewable heat in the system. Okay, hopefully that clarifies that. I think we have another similar point here from Jury. To meet the 1.5 degree target for fossil fuel must be left in the ground. Is this considered by the biofuels industry? It seems to me that the targets as presented here are made in Rotterdam by the fossil fuel industry. So maybe it's more of a comment, Noel.
Yeah, look, we agree there's a lack of ambition at 10%, a huge lack of ambition at 3%, but a lack of ambition at 10% as well.
Okay. What are your thoughts on including CHP operators in the obligation, and why are they being specifically targeted?
Well, CHP, the inclusion there is that if you're using a fossil fuel in CHP, that you are required, the heat side of that does require to meet the obligation as well. So look, we would agree with that as an organisation. CHP units are effectively, you know, it's where you're using fossil fuel to produce heat and power, and ultimately that has been an interim measure to try and reduce emissions but overall, there's a question over whether it's really reduced emissions much in any shape or form. So, ultimately, any use of any fossil fuel should be subject to the obligation.
Okay. Just a comment from James here: the number of large thermal end users were off the grid, and where biomass will not meet their requirements. They currently use fossil or fuel oil, kerosene to meet their needs. However, they have resources in their supply base to produce adequate volumes of biomethane. Logic says the development of an adjacent biomethane plant would be the option. This model doesn't seem to work under the obligation proposal. Certificates would need to be traded, removing the green credentials of the gas supplied directly to the end users. So, what's your comment about off-grid gas, Noel, and on this point from James?
There's a couple of things to discuss on that, and he raises a good point as well in terms of the green credentials and where does that go. There is definitely, we think within the scheme, it doesn't, there seems to be pushing towards putting a gas on the grid, and that's one thing we'll have a comment on, in the fact that we think any renewable gas should be, and any renewable gas, as long as it meets the requirements of the RED directive, will be able to generate those certs. But the question is then, how do you get value for those certs? You need to trade them with a fossil fuel supplier. So that's, that's one of the areas where we have some level of discomfort in the fact that we need to have an open marketplace where the fossil fuel supplier is obliged to buy those certificates rather than it being brought in from another country. So we need to, and perhaps that a mechanism like that will assist on it. Now, just going back to the question again, just to make sure I'm covering the points. So, definitely putting in an adjacent biomethane plant where you've got the material available makes an awful lot of sense. In fact, it's a no-brainer in many situations. So some high capital cost, but it makes a lot of sense both from a recycling point of view as well as the energy point of view.
But just to clarify, Noel, that gas would obviously have to be certified gas.
Yes.
So
there needs to be a certification mechanism for that. Now,
in terms of sustainability criteria.
Yes, to prove that it is meeting the requirements of the RED II directive. Or as RED II is going to change possibly in the next while to RED III, it'll be determined.
Okay, we're coming to the end, Noel. There are a couple of questions that have just come in there. We need to finish at 10:30. We'll try and get to them. Just a question from Colin there. Hi guys, Noel said that the biomass suppliers could sell certificates to fossil fuel suppliers. Any idea what this would look like? So
that's one of the big questions we have at the minute, because although you're able to generate the certificates, at the moment the onus is on the fossil fuel supplier needs to be willing to buy them off you, and that is the difficulty we've had in the Biofuel Obligation Scheme. They found it much easier to meet their obligation through imported materials. So we've got to look at a mechanism to allow that sort of trading of those certificates, and to ensure that we've got a means to allow your renewable fuel supplier, biomass, whatever it happens to be, to actually trade correctly with it.
Okay, just another question. Who would claim the carbon credits for the GHG savings in a government-supported heat obligation? If, for example, a farmer grows energy crop or produces straw to generate heat, and at some stage in the future they claim a carbon value for the feedstock which they put on the market, will the state claim carbon credits, or can the farmer through a carbon trading platform claim the credit? So
that's another area where clarification is needed, because now if you look at something like the refit scheme, or the carbon credits, or even the forestry scheme, the carbon credits are owned by the government. It's within the small print area. They're giving you a subsidy for doing whatever that activity is, and they're claiming back the carbon credits. It belongs to the state. In this, the fact that it's an obligation scheme is a question. Now, what the mechanism which may be the case here is every fossil fuel, regardless of how it's used or whether it's offset or whatever, still generates a carbon tax. You still have to pay carbon tax on that, and every renewable fuel does not, as long as it meets the requirements, even if it's used in the heat obligation scheme. So you could end up having a situation where now this is my understanding, but it needs clarification. And you could have a situation where you could be producing a lot of renewable heat. You are gaining those credits. You're not paying carbon tax on it. You're selling your certificates to a fossil fuel supplier. who is able to meet their obligation using your certificates, but they're still having to pay fossil or carbon tax, I would expect, on the fossil fuel that they use. It's a separate mechanism, but there's clarification needed around that, and it's a good question. That and again, it goes back to the previous comment by James in terms of the green credentials. Where does that go in terms of? And we, unfortunately, the carbon trading is a bit of a no man's land at the moment, because there's a lot of voluntary schemes. There's no recognised, apart from the likes of DTS, but there's a lot of voluntary schemes. So how do you ultimately account for that and determine?
And I guess this is an area that will be further developed as time goes on, and the various interactions between the obligation schemes and the various trading schemes will have to be further explored and ironed out. I think there's just one final point, or maybe two, just from Joe, just to note that if a supplier of renewable heat or district heating exceeds 400 gigawatt hours, then they will come under the energy efficiency obligation, which also has a 400 gigawatt threshold. So I think it's just a clarification.
That's interesting. It does.
You know how the a commenter from Stevie, do you know how the RHO will interact with the EEOS, so the Energy Efficiency Obligation Scheme? Something we need to probably look into, Noel. I think you've said that before.
Yeah, we had a question on that earlier on, so it is something that, it's not clear.
That's really it. I don't think there's a couple of other questions, but unfortunately time has got the better of us, and we it's unlikely that we will get to you, get to the questions, the final questions. I'd like to also thank those who put in comments in terms of the information provided on the Q&A for us as well. I suppose it's our objective as an organisation to provide information to members, to stakeholders, and indeed the wider public about schemes like this. And we strongly encourage everyone that attended this morning to make your submissions. The questions are quite straightforward in terms of the consultation. We encourage you to make your submissions. If you need any further clarification, feel free to get in touch with myself or Noel. You can contact us by email or by a phone, and full details are available through our website in terms of contacting us as well. We'll be happy to discuss offline with anyone any particular aspects of the consultation and raise any queries with the department that might arise. So thanks very much to Noel. Again, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Teresa for your contribution and assistance in getting this set up, and we'll leave it at that. And thanks to you all for joining, and we look forward to meeting you again in early October for the first of our conference special webinars, and hopefully you will join us for the 4 webinars in the month of October as we roll out our conference special. So we'll leave it at that, and thanks very much everyone. Talk to you all again soon. Stay safe and take care. Bye-bye.